You know, actually, a group of historians in the year 2000 were polled and were asked what was the most important person of the last millennium. And they ended up voting not for a person, Hitler, Shakespeare. They ended up voting for Yersinia pestis, which is the plague Bacillus. They ended up voting that the Black Death was the most important event. So if you're going to, that's fascinating. If we were going to answer this question, we'd have to then say, first of all, certainly if measured in terms of the traumatic loss of life of a group of people, the magnitude of it was unparalleled, and even compares to, say, the massive loss of life that was incurred by the native peoples of the Americas after the arrival of Europeans. It is comparable in scope in some sense to the Holocaust if we think about numbers. I'm not making any kinds of judgments here. So absolutely, it was an incredibly traumatic event. We would also then need to think about what were the after effects for the survivors. Obviously for the people who died, it was traumatic, but for the survivors, it was also extremely traumatic. And like the other events I mentioned, it really transforms people's worldview. They think about the world in different ways. Their traditional ideas about their duties and relationships to their neighbors and their relatives have been radically transformed by this massive loss of life. The other thing that would make this the most important event, arguably, of the millennium is the fact that the world after the Black Death was a depopulated world. 1/2 to 1/3 of the populations, not just of Europe, but of the Near East, have died. And that means that for the survivors, for the first time, there is open land ready to be settled and colonized. This had not happened for centuries. So that for the people who survived, who were enterprising, they could increase their holdings. It meant that farmers were no longer under pressure to produce staple foodstuffs like wheat and corn, but they were able to diversify, so that the diet of the surviving Europeans becomes diversified. People are eating meat for the first time, people are eating vegetables, so their nutrition is better, they're living longer, so people are healthier, the survivors. Europe's cities, which had been massively overpopulated, become smaller. The populations become smaller, living space becomes more available, disease is more easily controlled. But probably the most important effect is the social effect. The fact that workers in Europe, for the first time, are valuable, and they know it. The workforce is no longer flooded with artisans and laborers and plowmen and serfs. And in fact, governments know this. In England, Parliament passes a law called the Statute of Labourers, which is intended to keep workers on the land and keep them from moving around looking for jobs for better wages. It doesn't work. There's a wave of rebellions all over Europe. Both in urban areas and rural areas, as workers essentially unite together in ways that are more familiar to us from the 19th and 20th centuries, because they recognize that through solidarity they might actually be able to push forward some form of rights. My favorite event in all of these is the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381, where tens of thousands of peasants, most of them illiterate, march on London, demanding that all the lawyers be killed, managing to capture and behead the Archbishop of Canterbury, holding the king, Richard II, hostage. And their rebellion fails, but it's an extraordinary expression of, for those first generation people after the Black Death, of the sort of social mobility that is potentially going to be possible in this brave new world.